sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till I get enough.
All right, so today we're going to be diving into some pretty choppy waters, I'd say. The potential TikTok ban. 170 million Americans use the app.
Sheesh.
And the Supreme Court just basically said, yeah, you can totally ban it. And it could be kicked off U.S. app stores in just 48 hours.
2 days.
Yeah, just 2 days.
Wild.
It's crazy. The stakes are high, so let's try to unpack this, I guess.
It really is. I mean, it's not just about losing, funny dances and the trends and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
This case really gets to the heart of some big issues,
Yeah.
national security, free speech, the whole U.S.-China relationship. We could go on and on.
For sure. I mean, just the backstory here is wild. We've got bipartisan concern in Congress about, TikTok's Chinese parent company,
Right.
ByteDance. And, the concern is that they could potentially be sharing user data with the Chinese government. And that led to this law, the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary-Controlled Applications Act.
Catchy.
I know, right? It's a mouthful.
The mouthful.
But basically it says, hey, TikTok, you got to break up with ByteDance or you're going to get kicked off U.S. app stores. And now the Supreme Court has said, yeah, that law totally makes sense.
Totally. Yeah. And what's really fascinating to me here is that the Supreme Court was unanimous in this decision.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's unusual.
Right. We often see these split decisions, especially on issues this complex and this controversial. But all of them were on the same page here.
Wow.
That says something about how seriously they're taking this threat,
It really does make you think, what do they see that maybe we don't? What's the legal reasoning, I guess, behind all of this?
Well, so historically, the Supreme Court has given a lot of deference to Congress when it comes to national security matters.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of, they tend to defer to the judgment of the legislative branch, especially when it comes to potential foreign threats and stuff like that.
Sure.
And in this case, it seems like what they're saying is that even if, the risks posed by TikTok are not totally proven, they're still significant enough to justify this level of intervention by the government.
So basically they're saying better safe than sorry.
Yeah, in a nutshell. Yeah. I mean, they're essentially saying that the potential harm to national security, if TikTok did share user data,
Right.
would outweigh the company's right to just keep operating in the U.S. the way that it is.
But hold on now, didn't TikTok's lawyers argue that this ban violates their First Amendment rights?
They did.
I mean, that's a big deal.
It is a big deal, and it gets to the heart of how we even define speech in the digital age,
Right.
Like TikTok argued that preventing them from operating here is basically the same as censoring, the voices of millions of Americans who create content and share it on the platform.
That's where it gets interesting for me, I think. Is sharing a dance video really the same, as writing an op-ed or giving a political speech?
Right.
Did the Supreme Court buy that?
It's a really tricky question. And honestly, it seems like the justices weren't so sure themselves. During the oral arguments, Justice Clarence Thomas actually asked exactly what is TikTok's speech here.
Oh, wow.
So, that suggests some skepticism about whether or not TikTok's activities, deserve that same level of protection as, traditional forms of speech.
Okay, so we've got national security concerns, potential First Amendment issues, and let's toss one more ingredient into this already potent mix.
Oh, boy.
President-elect Trump.
Yeah.
He's been sending mixed signals about TikTok.
For sure.
On one hand, he was very supportive of the law that could lead to the ban. But on the other hand, he's reportedly considering delaying its enforcement or even weakening it. What is going on there?
Well, this kind of unpredictable move is pretty characteristic of Trump's approach.
Yeah.
I think some experts believe that, he might be using TikTok as leverage
Interesting.
in his negotiations with China. Maybe he sees it as a bargaining chip to, extract concessions on trade, or who knows?
So he's playing like a game of international chess with TikTok as his pawn. Yeah.
Exactly. High stakes game with a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, for sure. It's wild, and it's worth noting that even if, the ban does go through, separating TikTok from ByteDance is a lot more complicated than just like flipping a switch.
Absolutely.
What would actually have to happen for them to comply with this law?
So it's a complex process called divestiture. And it's not just about selling the company. It's about disentangling all this technical infrastructure, the algorithms, the data storage, all of which is, intertwined with ByteDance's operations in China.
Right.
And according to our source, the heart of it, the source code and the intellectual property is all housed in China.
Oh, wow.
Which makes things even more complicated.
Given those technical ties to China, is it even possible for TikTok to fully separate itself from ByteDance in a way that would actually satisfy the government?
I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
We're talking about untangling this huge web of technology and data intellectual property, all of it spanning across two of the world's most powerful economies.
Yeah.
It's a mess.
It's intense. And meanwhile, you've got millions of American TikTok users who are just like, wait, is my app going to disappear?
Right. I mean, it really illustrates just how much global politics and technology are, they're just completely intertwined these days.
Yeah.
The decisions that are made in Washington and Beijing can directly impact our everyday lives, even down to the apps that we use to connect with each other and, share silly videos.
Wow. So we've got this ticking clock, potential legal challenges, political maneuvering, and a whole lot of uncertainty. Where do we even begin to unpack the potential consequences of all of this?
Well, let's start with the free speech implications.
Yeah.
If the U.S. government can just ban TikTok because of national security concerns, what's to stop them from targeting other apps or technologies down the line?
That's a scary thought. Could this set a precedent for more government control over what we can access online?
It's a very real concern, and it really raises some important questions about how we balance national security with, individual freedoms in this digital age.
Right.
It's tough.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we're just getting started.
Oh, yeah.
We'll be right back to dive even deeper into the potential consequences of this ban, the impact on American TikTok users, and what this all means for the future of social media. Don't go anywhere.
This is just the tip of the iceberg.
So we were talking about, this whole idea that this ban could actually set a precedent for even more government control over what we see and do online.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just a theoretical concern, right?
Yeah.
Like, we're already seeing governments all over the world, grapple with how to regulate these tech giants, especially the ones that are based in countries with different political systems or values.
Right. So this isn't just a U.S. versus China thing. It's like a global trend.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. If the U.S. can ban TikTok, couldn't other countries ban American social media platforms?
Oh, wow.
Based on, their own national security concerns or ideological differences?
Yeah.
I mean, it opens up a can of worms, right? Yeah. We could end up with a bunch of these fragmented country-specific internets instead of one global internet.
Oh, man. That sounds like a nightmare for, free expression, the open exchange of ideas that we kind of take for granted.
Yeah, it's a very real possibility and something we should be, paying attention to. I mean, the internet was designed to be this, decentralized, borderless network. But as it's grown more powerful, more influential, governments are really looking for ways to control it.
And in the case of TikTok, it's not just, the Chinese government that raises concerns. We talked earlier about how the company's source code and some of its intellectual property is still housed in China. What are the implications of that, even if, TikTok does divest from ByteDance?
That's a great point. Even with a divestiture, those underlying technical ties could still be there.
Right.
So there are still concerns about data security control over the platform's algorithms.
Yeah.
Even the potential for censorship or manipulation by,
So even a clean break might not be so clean after all.
Exactly. It just shows how complex this globalized tech landscape really is, where lines of ownership and control and data flow, they all get blurred.
Okay, so let's bring this back to the U.S. What are some of the specific concerns that people have raised about TikTok and national security?
Well, one of the biggest fears is that the Chinese government could pressure ByteDance to hand over user data, right? And then they could use that for anything from surveillance to, targeted propaganda. There are also concerns about TikTok's algorithms being manipulated to promote certain viewpoints or suppress others, basically turning it into a tool for information warfare.
But TikTok has said over and over again that they've never shared user data with the Chinese government and that they have all these, robust security measures in place to protect user privacy.
Right. And it's important to acknowledge that there's no, concrete evidence that TikTok has actually mishandled user data.
Okay.
But the lack of transparency about how those algorithms work, coupled with the Chinese government's track record on censorship and surveillance, it fuels a lot of suspicion.
It's a classic case of where there's smoke, there's fire, even if we don't see the flames yet.
Exactly. And when it comes to national security, even the perception of a threat can be enough to trigger some pretty drastic actions.
So where does all this leave the 170 million American TikTok users? What happens to them if the ban goes into effect?
Well, I mean, the most obvious impact is that they lose access to the app, right? No more scrolling through the For You page, no more creating videos, sharing them with friends.
Right.
I mean, for a lot of users, it'd be like losing a community, a creative outlet, even a source of income for some people.
You're right. I hadn't even considered the creators and influencers who, rely on TikTok for their livelihoods. For some of them, it's not just a hobby, it's their job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A ban could have a devastating economic impact on that whole segment of the creator economy that's built their business around TikTok.
Wow. And even for those who don't use TikTok themselves, there's this bigger question of what does this mean for the future of social media, online expression in the U.S.?
All right, if the government can ban one app based on national security concerns, where does it end? Could other social media platforms be targeted next? Could we see, restrictions on certain types of content, limits on who can access certain online services?
That's a pretty chilling thought. It's like we're on the edge of some kind of digital dystopia.
It's not hyperbole to say that this case has the potential to, reshape the digital landscape as we know it, and it really underscores the need for us to have this, nuanced and informed public debate about how we balance security and freedom online.
All right, let's take a quick pause here. When we come back, we'll explore some potential alternative scenarios. All of this means for U.S.-China relations and the ethical considerations of this whole situation. Stay tuned. All right, we're back, and things are definitely getting intense as we kind of wrap up our look at this TikTok ban. Before the break, we were talking about some pretty, heavy potential consequences like government overreach, online fragmentation, even a digital dystopia. But is there any other way this could go? Any glimmers of hope for TikTok and its users?
Yeah, I mean, it's not all doom and gloom. There are a few potential paths forward that could, maybe prevent the worst case scenarios. Okay. One possibility is that TikTok could reach some kind of compromise with the U.S. government.
Okay.
Maybe involving, some form of independent oversight or, data security guarantees.
So like having some kind of watchdog group that, keeps an eye on TikTok, make sure they're not doing anything shady with data.
Exactly. It could involve allowing, U.S.-based security experts to audit their algorithms and data practices, or even requiring them to store user data on servers that are actually located in the U.S.
That sounds a lot more reasonable than just banning it outright.
Right.
Would that actually address those national security concerns without, completely killing the platform?
Yeah, it could definitely be a possibility. Mm. The devil's in the details, though, right?
Sure.
Any agreement like that would have to be very carefully crafted to ensure both security and transparency.
Right. And what about the Chinese government? Would they be okay with, this level of scrutiny on a Chinese-owned company?
That's the big question mark.
Right.
The Chinese government has historically been very protective of their tech companies.
Right.
And they might see this kind of oversight as, stepping on their toes, interfering with their sovereignty.
So even a compromise could be tricky to pull off. What are some other potential outcomes?
One other possibility is that this whole thing could get tied up in court.
Right.
A legal battle that drags on for months or even years.
Wow.
TikTok's lawyers have already said they plan to fight the ban. So, they could potentially delay things for a while.
So TikTok could basically buy itself some time while the courts try to figure things out.
Exactly. And during that time, maybe they could negotiate a deal with the government or even find a buyer for their U.S. operations.
Yeah.
Someone that satisfies both sides.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got compromise, we've got legal battles. Any other wild cards we should be thinking about?
Well, one factor that's really hard to predict is, public opinion.
Right.
TikTok has a huge and very vocal user base, and they could put a lot of pressure on the government to back down.
It's sure. 170 million users is a lot of folks.
Right.
If they make enough noise, it could definitely make politicians think twice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Politicians tend to pay attention when a lot of their constituents are unhappy.
Of course.
And, in this age of social media, it's easier than ever for people to mobilize and make their voices heard.
It sounds like the future of TikTok in the U.S. is still really uncertain. So stepping back a bit, what does this whole saga tell us about the bigger picture of U.S.-China relations?
Well, I think it's a pretty clear sign that tensions between these two superpowers are escalating. And technology is increasingly becoming a battleground in this rivalry.
Right.
We see this happening not just with TikTok, but also with other Chinese tech companies like Huawei and ZTE. They've also faced similar scrutiny and restrictions from the U.S. government.
So this is part of this broader trend of distrust and competition between the U.S. and China.
Absolutely. And it's a trend that's likely to continue as both countries, try to become the dominant force in technology and exert global influence.
It's kind of a sobering picture of the future,
Yeah.
technology dividing us instead of bringing us together.
It's a real concern.
Yeah.
And it really emphasizes how important dialogue and diplomacy are.
Yeah.
Recognizing that cooperation is ultimately in everyone's best interest.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you hope listeners will take away from this conversation?
I think the most important takeaway is that technology is not neutral.
Okay.
It's shaped by politics, by economic interests, by cultural values. And as technology becomes more and more intertwined with our lives, it's so important that we have these thoughtful discussions about its impact, both the good and the bad.
So we need to be more than just, passive users of technology. We need to be informed citizens engaged in the conversations that will shape the digital world.
Exactly. Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
I mean, the future of the internet, the future of the world really depends on it.
That's a powerful thought to end on. Well, that wraps up our look at the TikTok ban. Remember, folks, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay curious. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.
Sound the alarm. I'm coming up. We'll have a ball. I'm sweet like a buttercup. You're a Barbie doll. Show them all what I'm made of. Strut down the hall. Won't stop till